Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it is March the 13th, 2025. A couple of weeks ago, we did a great show with a very senior person at the Atlantic, Yoni Applebaum. He has a new book out. It's been very influential. Stuck, How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. It's a book about how people are staying in the same place, literally and metaphorically. And there's another book that's just come out that very much dovetails with the Applebaum book. It's called Why Nothing Works. It's by Marc J. Dunkelman. It's having quite a big impact as well. And I'm thrilled that Marc Dunkelman is joining us from his home in Rhode Island, where, Marc, I assume some stuff still works.
Some things do work. That's right. Rhode Island is great. The beaches certainly still work. And yeah, you're absolutely right. There are parts of government that still work well.
So I know you've known Applebaum over the years, and you did an event with him actually recently. How do these books fit together? It's rather like Revolutions in Eastern Europe or London Buses. You wait for ages and ages, and then two or three come along at the same time. And of course, Ezra Klein has his new book out with Derek Thompson, Abundance, which also I think fits together with your thesis.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how we all got to the same thesis. I guess, suppose we've all been talking together for a long time. The books are similar insofar as they all look beyond the notion that conservatism has broken government. They are all looking for some sort of explanation for progressive frustration that is beyond blaming the opposition. And I think, we've spent as progressives the better part of 10 years screaming about how terrible Donald Trump is. And I don't think we've necessarily been wrong.
Yeah, I don't think that's news on March 13th, 2025, Marc.
No, and that is not news. But somehow screaming about it hasn't convinced people that they ought to stick with us. And so I think that there's a feeling in some parts of our movement that it is time for us to look inside our own dogma and see whether there aren't parts of our own agenda that are vexing our well-intentioned purposes. And to some degree, I think that Abundance by Ezra and Derek, Yoni's terrific book, and mine are all birds of a feather.
Yeah, it's interesting. And the other book that comes to mind, I'm sure you're familiar with it, is David Leonhardt's book. Ours was The Shining Future. David was on the show last year. And that book I thought was pretty interesting. And it shared your thesis, I think, about what happened in the 1960s. Maybe I'm putting words into your mouth, Marc. But my understanding of your thesis is that the problem with the progressive loss of faith, falling out of love with central government, or the effectiveness of central government, can be traced back to the 1960s. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, my general point of view is that progressivism from its very birth has had two competing impulses. One which wants to lionize centralized government, and one which is very worried about coercive institutions. And those two things have existed in sort of a yin and yang. But you are right that during the, certainly maybe starting in the late 50s with the Beat Poets and with C. Wright Mills and then into the 60s with the Students for Democratic Society and the New Left and the Port Huron Statement, and then with the counterculture and civil rights movement and second wave feminism, you get to a point where the skepticism about government overwhelms the hopefulness that it can do great things.
You distinguish these two traditions. One you associate with Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, and the other with Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, although I'm not sure everyone considers Teddy Roosevelt a progressive. Perhaps before we get to that distinction,
Sure.
what for you is a progressive? Is it someone who believes in government? Because there are some conservatives who also believe in government.
Well, everyone believes in government. So, like, right? We all, I think, even most libertarians believe that someone needs to determine whether we drive on the left or the right side of the road. Someone needs to make that decision for all of us, or else it's going to be a mess on the streets. I don't have a precise definition for progressive. It is not conservative. That's sort of the core of my thesis. Is that when I say progressive, I don't mean the very far left. I mean anyone who believes that we as a society have big problems and that those problems should be addressed in part, if possible or if convenient, by public authority. So I believe that things as they are today can be better, and that we ought to find the best way to get there. My view in general is that conservatism says things used to be better, and we ought to go back to that way of doing things. And that's not my perspective. I think most progressives would make at least that distinction. But the labels are hard, and that's where I would leave it. It's pretty amorphous.
Yeah, and the subtitle perhaps is The Giveaway: Who Killed Progress and How to Bring It Back. You believe in the idea of progress, or at least for you, progress is a matter of moving forward rather than backwards. It's got nothing to do with returning to something. It's going somewhere else. And of course, this idea of motion is more than just metaphorical. For you, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, but what used to work in America is a government's appetite, both the state and the political apparatus, for building stuff, whether it's the Tennessee Valley Project or railroads or bridges. Is that fair?
Well, there are certain problems that you find, what you would call a classic tragedy of the common, where we ourselves can't solve the problem. I can't solve the problem by myself that there's no sewer system in the neighborhood. I can't solve the problem that there's no way to get across the river. We all need to find some means together to solve these problems. And in those cases, government is the convenient institution to do that. And in each of those circumstances, you need to take the power that each of us has individually and give it to some institution above us, some authority, some bureaucracy, some power broker. That's the sort of the core of in the distinction you just made. Theodore Roosevelt's view was for a robust, centralized bureaucracy, and that was in some way the original progressive vision. Theodore Roosevelt was an original progressive in the notion that he believed in a big, robust, centralized administration that would play a powerful role regulating society and doing these things that we couldn't do individually. And so that's, I would actually associate it even more with Alexander Hamilton, but that there's from Hamilton in the early days of the Republic through Roosevelt, and then through FDR and LBJ in many ways, there is this progressive impulse to put power in the hands of centralized authority that can do big things. Andrew, I'm having trouble hearing you. Just a little bit. Now a little bit better.
I'm going to repeat myself. For you, Marc, FDR's state was the ideal version of this when stuff actually worked. I wouldn't say you're nostalgic for that, but is that the model or the LBJ model?
Well, no, I think there needs to be a balance of that model, which is to centralize authority, with a second model, which is very suspicious of centralized authority. I am both aware that untrammeled centralized authority can be abusive and coercive, and aware that if you take that power and diffuse it so thoroughly that no one can make a decision or ratify a trade-off or broach a compromise, that both of those are lousy outcomes for people who are progressives. Right, both having an abusive centralized authority figure, like the quintessential example, I'm sure you plan to ask me about this later in the interview, is Robert Moses, who was the most powerful figure in New York from the 1930s to the 1960s, never elected, but built highways and parks and housing projects in Jones Beach and the Lincoln Center and the UN, and was just a man without any equal who could overcome the objections of mayors, governors, presidents, you name it, and bend the city to his will, and who was exposed in this famous book, The Power Broker, by Robert Caro, which came out in 1974 and subsequently won the Pulitzer Prize. That is one extreme. That is a Hamiltonian or Theodore Rooseveltian extreme that is abusive and coercive and awful in many ways. The other extreme is where we are today, where no one can do any of the projects that Moses did because power is so thoroughly diffused and almost anyone can veto almost anything. So we've gone from one extreme where Moses could do bad projects like the Cross Bronx Expressway, despite everyone saying no, to a circumstance today where even projects that everyone says yes to can't get off the ground.
Let's return to the politics of this. The title of a piece you wrote for The Atlantic, which was adapted from the book, was How Progressives Broke the Government. We touched on this earlier, Marc, but how are progressives? Is this a return again to David Leonhardt's thesis about the 60s? Can we blame it all on SDS or the Black Panthers or the feminists? Is this a political argument?
Well, it is a political argument in that previous to that era, at the core of the progressive zeitgeist was a belief that we ought to give power to wise, centralized, bureaucratic figures who would work the public interest against private and parochial concerns. And that was the predominant view. And then in the 60s, this different view, which is that authority was abusive and coercive, settler colonial, imperial, racist, untrustworthy, unworthy of the public's esteem, that the centralized zeitgeist of progressivism after that era was, how do we put new checks on those who wield power? And this is the needle I'm trying to thread here is not to be blaming exactly, despite the title of that piece in the Atlantic, not to be blaming any person for breaking the government, or to suggest that that anyone had ill intentions. My suggestion is that you've got these two impulses, one to push power up, the other to push power down, and that they need to be put in balance, and that they are no longer in balance. We are so consumed with our cultural aversion to power that we have made it impossible to build, and in so doing, we've sort of we rolled out the red carpet for a populist like Donald Trump.
Not in my backyard on a broad scale. I wonder, Marc, you were involved with the Clinton administration. Is this a return to the kind of intellectual civil war of the 1990s, maybe even the last 20 years within the Democratic Party? Are arguments like yours and books like Why Nothing Works the revenge of the centrists?
Well, my hope is that it's not. We have spent, as progressives, the better part of 3 or 4 decades emerging from election losses and having this sort of pointless debate about whether we needed to go 2 clicks to the left or 3 clicks to the center. And there's same familiar voices blame the progressives for being dreamy, and the sort of the far left progressives for being dreamy, and the far left progressives blame the centrists for failing to carry a torch for a true progressivism. My argument here is that these two impulses, to raise power up and to push it down, exist in the heart and mind of every progressive of every stripe. So take an issue that I don't deal with in the book, which is healthcare. There's no chapter on healthcare in the book. You could imagine dealing with healthcare with a Hamiltonian bent. And that's how many on the far left do imagine it. Medicare for all is giving one centralized government authority the ability to set insurance rates, set what the payments will be for various treatments and interventions. For what, that is a classic Hamiltonian intervention. So that is, in many ways, what the far left wants. So it's not to suggest that Hamiltonianism, in the Robert Moses sense, is something that the left would oppose. You could also say, in the healthcare space, what we ought to have is a patient's bill of rights that's much more robust. That's a classic Jeffersonian intervention. That's saying we're not going to deal with creating some centralized bureaucracy. We're going to give the individual patients rights that require the healthcare industry to respond to their demands. That's a classic Jeffersonian thing. And sometimes I think you would hear centrists be more supportive of that. So it's sort of the impulse, as I heard in your question, is to presume that the Hamiltonian notion is a more moderate and the Jeffersonian tradition is more far left. But that's I don't buy that distinction. I think that the notion that we are a movement vexed against ourselves should apply almost in equal measure to those who would associate themselves with the Bernie or Elizabeth Warren wing of the party as with the Obama or Clinton wing.
The real reason I think, Mark, you didn't write about healthcare in your book, you put up on social media that the book took you 10 years. If you'd put a chapter on healthcare, probably would have taken you 20 years. I'm not sure if I'm sure you know Tim Wu, who was also part of the Biden administration. Had him on the show a couple of weeks ago, and he has an interesting new piece in Liberties about his faith in what he calls decentralized capitalism. I'm not sure if you've ever crossed swords with him, but I'm not sure, I'm guessing you probably haven't read his piece on decentralized capitalism. But
now I want to.
Yeah, I think you'd be very, very intrigued, and I think he would be very intrigued by your book. Is there an argument in our networked age for decentralized capitalism that can escape from your Jeffersonian, Hamiltonian kind of Manichaean architecture?
Well, I having not read the piece, and I don't know Tim. Someone
of him,
promised. Yeah, someone has promised to introduce me, but we haven't been in touch yet. I don't want to speak directly to his argument because I just don't know it well enough. I will say this: there are elements of everyday life today that simply require some sort of trade-off. You can't build a transmission line that brings clean energy from where it's generated, maybe by a waterfall or a dam, to a place where it's going to be expended, without building a transmission line between those two places. You can't take advantage of all this new technology that we have to harness clean energy and replace fossil fuel burning generation unless you can build these transmission lines. Those transmission lines are going to be built at some cost, not just a financial cost. They're going to be built through forests, and they're going to be built near neighborhoods, and they're going to be built, in places where we have to take land from people that own it privately. And we need some system in these circumstances. We need some system to weigh the balance of public interests and private interests. It shouldn't be that by right, in all cases, the public interest trumps a private interest. There should be some things that are sacrosanct. We shouldn't necessarily destroy the habitat of an endangered species in order to harness a bit of clean energy. But by the same token, it can't be that every single objection is taken so seriously that the public interest never prevails. And that latter circumstance is where we are today. And so centralized, decentralized, we can sort of talk about these slightly fuzzy terms. The core of it is someone's got to choose stuff. We need some system for choosing stuff. And since the 1960s, to your point, we progressives have been so that the people who choose stuff will choose the wrong stuff, that we've made it impossible for anyone to ratify those sorts of trade-offs.
I wonder what it's such an interesting argument, Mark. And I wonder what your interpretation of, and so many people have written about this, is that the period you're describing in the 60s was when also the Democrats began to lose their hold on the working class. You had the hard hat rebellion and the change in the balance of power, the working class balance of power between Democrats and Republicans. Of course, it was the American working class, the hard hats, who built a lot of the projects you're talking about. How does this fit in your thesis about why nothing works? The shifts in political allegiance, and particularly the shift in the allegiance of the American working class, particularly the white working class, from Democrats, LBJ, FDR, to Reagan, and now Trump?
Well, it's a terrific question. There was this moment in 1968, which I think is a big pivot, where outside the Democratic Convention were the protesters who were sort of, of the new left, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. And inside were the gruff old establishment politicians, Richard Daley famously swearing up at Abraham Ribicoff, who had accused him of being like a leader of the Gestapo. And those two images are in some ways perfect distillations of the Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian worldviews. Daley was the old, establishment mayor of Chicago who built lots of stuff and was powerful and made trade-offs between ethnic constituencies and racial constituencies. There's a lot to complain about with Richard Daley.
To put it mildly, particularly his behavior in 1968 in Chicago.
Absolutely. But he was an embodiment, like Robert Moses, of an old school, charcoal suit wearing, powerful establishment. There were some distinctions. Robert Moses was sort of the intellectual elite, and Richard Daley would have considered himself a man of the working class. But outside was a demonstration that was really for a Hamiltonian, for a Jeffersonian alternative. Those marching outside really believed that the Daley machine was representative of a sort of an octopus of powerful interests that were all connected. The Rand Corporation, the military industrial complex, big agriculture, the big three automakers, the unions, you name it. And in that confrontation on the streets of Chicago, you sort of see this battle. What's so interesting to me is that the conventional wisdom is that in the end, with Hubert Humphrey's nomination from that convention, Daley's side won, and that the protesters outside, who were subjected to what many call a police riot, didn't. And then the sort of the verve behind the counterculture in the 60s begins to dissipate. From there, My view is that the protesters on the outside won. That by the time you get to the mid-70s, you have Robert Caro writing a book about Robert Moses that basically reflects the zeitgeist from the streets of Chicago. He is exposing in an extremely erudite way how the old octopus of powerful establishment figures has done the country wrong. And so you get a new crop of progressive politicians who at their core are suspicious of power, that they have imbibed the Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin ethos from the 60s. And that was appropriate. Like, the establishment had made terrible mistakes in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, from Robert McNamara and the Lyndon Johnson and the war, Bull Connor and Faubus and the Jim Crow establishment in the South, big ag throwing chemicals on crops such that people were having birth defects, unsafe at any speed, from Ralph Nader. Like, you could go, from root and branch to all these fairly coercive, awful renderings of the establishment and be very sympathetic to the view of those who were marching outside. And I don't want to, launder is the wrong word, but Caro's writing and his approach, which is basically to suggest, if you read all, whatever it is, 1,800 pages of The Power Broker, it really is the story that suggests that power corrupts and that absolute power corrupts absolutely. That Moses had been well-intentioned at the beginning, but then he became, through the course of his career, so drunk on power that he lost sight of what the public interest really was. So he had strangled New York in a series of expressways that were not actually in the public interest. They were sort of his personal parochial interest. He believed in cars and mobility in a way that wasn't realistic. And by the mid-70s, like, no one is really questioning whether the establishment was bad. Like, even in the culture, like the movies of that era, right? Chinatown is a movie about a villainous figure, not unlike Richard Daley or Robert McNamara or Robert Moses, who has taken the water from the valley outside LA and brought it into the city, right, at his own, to serve his own interests. Or Network, right? The famous line from Network. I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. That's a line from a movie, but it's a reflection of a general zeitgeist about the culture's new aversion to centralized authority. Now, I don't want to, the impulse when you go through a story like this and try to flatten it is to say that Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman were entirely wrong, and like there's a connection between that moment where progressivism shifts in its general worldview to today, where that zeitgeist has successfully inserted so many checks and balances into the system that we can't get anything done. And I do think there's a connection between the two. But the impulse shouldn't be now to swing the pendulum back to a day where Richard Daley and Robert McNamara and Robert Moses of the next generation can do whatever they want without anyone being able to stand up to them. It's to find some sort of balance where we are both protecting people's core rights, but also providing some mechanism to make decisions for the public interest.
Marc, I wonder what your interpretation is of the Biden administration. They poured huge amounts of money into public works or various kinds of public initiatives, the CHIPS and Science Act. Politico recently ran an interesting piece about 30 things Joe Biden did as president you might have missed. In terms of your thesis, was the problem with the Biden administration not that they didn't do things, but they were, and I think this probably fits into your argument, your broader argument, that they were almost ashamed to acknowledge what they were doing. They were ashamed to acknowledge that they are investing trillions of dollars in public works and public initiative. And Biden himself, in an odd kind of way, maybe we can't blame him for all this stuff, but the administration was the worst of all worlds.
there's a thing that happens in drag racing. I don't know if you follow drag racing.
And no, unfortunately, no.
I don't either, but I'm aware of this. Where before
Jeffersonian or Hamiltonian drag racing.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'll get to that. Give me a second. In drag racing, at the beginning of the race, there's an advantage to having your tires warm. I think you get a better grip on the asphalt, so you get more acceleration early in the race. So what drivers do before they get to the race is they put the pedal down on the brake and they put the pedal down on the accelerator at the same time. And what happens is that the back wheels spin, but the car doesn't go anywhere. So you get a big plume of smoke.
Right.
My argument is that the Biden administration did essentially this, and this is what progressivism has done. We've poured money, that's the accelerant, into the system over and over again, while systematically also putting on the brakes with new checks. So let me give you an example of this. The Biden administration, at the very beginning, it's part of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, set aside $5 billion to put electric vehicle chargers in the places along the nation's highways where it did not make economic sense to have a charger because not enough electric vehicles would charge there, but that you needed to have because people, absent knowing that there would be chargers every 50 miles, won't buy an electric vehicle. They're afraid that when they're driving to grandma's house for Thanksgiving, they'll get stuck and be unable to charge their car. So the Biden administration was going to fill in those gaps with this $5 billion program. 3 years later, at the end of the Biden administration, $5 billion had gotten us 58 chargers. That's not a good return on investment. Now, I think probably in the next few years, barring some sort of, who knows what's going to happen with the Trump administration. I think that many more chargers will eventually open. But the reason that it took so long for many chargers to come online was because even though the Biden administration gave them a categorical exclusion for many environmental laws, many states decided to do environmental reviews of the potential places where the chargers were going to go anyway. In some cases, states that received these funds had no experience knowing how to contract with electricians, right? The highway departments had knew a whole range of asphalt pouring companies. They could build bridges, they could build roads, but they didn't know how to build electric vehicle chargers or who was competent. So it took them time to stand up a program where they could pre-approve potential companies to do it. It took time to figure out what sorts of charging equipment you would have at each station. Would it fit a Tesla? Would it fit a Hyundai? Which one? And because those take different kinds of mechanisms, and protect. But I think this is potentially the cause of the biggest delay. These charging stations, which were going to be in remote places where there weren't a lot of cars, needed to be connected to the grid. And who connects places like this to the grid? Not the federal government, but the local utility. And these local utilities are now today being asked to provide more and more energy, often to AI, chip warehouses and all sorts of fancy power burning facilities. And these little chargers are not going to provide much return to a utility investor. So, but the Biden administration had no leverage over the utilities to get them to put the EV charging equipment at the front of the line. So what's so remarkable here is that I think that the Biden administration was right on many of these fronts to try to pursue public investments that would have a big return. The fault here is that at the same time we were pushing as progressives, we were pushing for big investments. We were not clearing the way from the regulatory barriers that make it so cumbersome.
So you had the worst of all worlds. You had massive, quote unquote, public investment, but you didn't have, I don't know, the political will or the political architecture or economic architecture to actually enforce what you were doing or realize what you were doing. It really was an absurd kind of catastrophe, wasn't it?
Yeah, I am very hesitant to call it political will. I don't think that these. I don't know that you could, in the course of any 4-year administration, return to the framework of power that allowed David Lilienthal, who ran the Tennessee Valley Authority in the 1930s, to hire federal workers to claim land, to flood using dams whole areas so there were reservoirs to create power. To there was no mechanism for giving the people in the Tennessee Valley any sorts of rights against the demands of the Tennessee Valley Authority. It was just a complete monolith. And the question you're asking is, or the suggestion you're making is that if Biden had somehow willed it, or imagined it, or that the people who had worked for him had been more demanding, that they would have been able to move through these things. I just don't. I don't know that I think that after 50 years of progressives working so hard to insert checks on government, that you could expect in the course of 4 for them to deconstruct those checks in a way that was satisfying to everyone. But it's a problem, and in the long term, we all need to be addressing it.
I don't want to talk too much about Trump, but he's, for better or worse, unavoidable. Your book comes with a very nice blurb from John Rausch, an old friend. He's been on the show lots of times. He says, richly researched, compellingly argued, and sparklingly entertaining, which is a good advertisement to read the book. He had a recent piece in The Atlantic, where you also write, on Trump as a patrimonial leader. And that seems to be manifested in all sorts of ways about his determination to essentially turn the government into just his own personal fiefdom as we speak. There are all sorts of arguments about whether he has the right to get rid of most federal workers. In a historical sense, Mark, is Trump and, of course, Elon Musk, the famous chainsaw-wielding CEO of Tesla, are they providing a political opportunity for quote-unquote progressives like yourself to reestablish the credibility and viability of the kind of government that you're supporting in Why Nothing Works? It seems as if you can't take advantage of this moment, you'll never be able to take advantage of any moment in history.
I think that we progressives are just so internally conflicted about this and so unaware of it. I don't know whether we'll take advantage of it or not. I hope we do. A year ago, the Supreme Court overturned something called Chevron deference. Chevron deference had been this Reagan-era doctrine that essentially the Supreme Court said to lower courts, when there's a relatively minor regulatory question, you should defer to the administrative state. You should defer to the executive branch and let them do their job. They're the experts. We in the judiciary should get out of the way. And we as progressives were outraged because we believed in the regulatory state. We believed in the experts being able to exert their power. And so we were sort of on the side of the executive branch over the judicial branch. That was our view a year ago. Here we are a year later, and we've taken exactly the opposite view. Our view is that the executive branch is abusive, that Trump is a catastrophe, and we are praying that the courts will stand up to him and preserve our democracy. And I don't think that either of those opinions, our anger at the overturning of Chevron a year ago, and our anger at Trump and Musk's behavior and their efforts to take a chainsaw to the federal bureaucracy, I don't think that we're wrong on either front. But I do think that we need to have some unified view of how we're going to balance the notion that the government needs to be able to make decisions expeditiously, which is what the executive branch is supposed to do, and that the executive branch shouldn't be able to do it with total impunity. And so my view, sort of to turn your question upside down, my view is that we broke the government, and by breaking it, we essentially invited the working class and the growing, frustrated cohort of voters that embraced Trump, who saw the world as it was, saw that we didn't have enough housing, that we weren't able to build infrastructure, that we couldn't take advantage of the clean energy revolution, that all these things were failures of government. As Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson pointed out, they are more frequently more protracted in blue states than they are in red states. And they said to themselves, this is an incompetent institution, the government. And this guy, Trump, I don't like him personally. I don't like his rhetoric. I don't like the way he behaves. I don't like his history. I don't like a lot about him. But all of those things, his just the crudity was a symbol that he was going to be rough on this failed institution. And they wanted that. They wanted someone to take a sledgehammer, a chainsaw, what you pick your analogy, to this institution that had fundamentally failed. And I think that the reason that people were frustrated because we as progressives took our eye off the ball over the last 50 years and become so drunk on this cultural aversion to power that we did not see how we were preventing the institution that we want to use to help people to actually perform.
Finally, so we've got this cultural aversion to power amongst quote unquote we progressives. I mean, I don't disagree with you. I consider myself a progressive and I agree with your thesis. So what is the solution? You've noted that you can't just do this stuff without certain kinds of political will. David Leonhardt seems to argue in his book that everything went wrong. The American dream died in June 1968 when RFK was assassinated. Is the solution to this from a progressive point of view, Marc, another version of RFK, someone who believes in government but is also a populist and people will believe in, who is able to skate over all the cultural contradictions of power and who embrace power rather than is shy of it? I mean, the person who comes to mind in that sense might be Gavin Newsom. Is the first step in the way of out of all this a political one? Is it a return to an RFK, a Newsom, maybe even a Bill Clinton?
I think before we start talking about personalities, we need to start talking about what we're going to do when we get back into power. What is the core? What is the Walter Lippmann, the famous journalist from the early and mid 20th century, coined a phrase, stories in our heads. The world is so complicated that we basically have to understand it. We have to have a core narrative in our heads. And for 50 years, the narrative in our heads as progressives has been primarily, there are powerful institutions in the world. They are oppressive and we need to break free of them. I think we need to change and at least layer on top of that narrative another narrative, which is that government doesn't work and we need to find ways to fix it. At the end of the Biden administration, there was an effort among moderate Democrats, some others, some Republicans, to do something called, it sounds so boring, permitting reform. That was the phrase. And the idea was we need to make it easier to get things permitted. Sort of remarkable, it died in the end. They couldn't quite get the thing through the Senate. And what's so remarkable to me is that that is sort of seen as a peripheral issue for progressives. It's not something that you hear about on the campaign trail. I mean, frankly, if someone were to say permitting reform to me in any conversation over a glass of wine, I think I might fall on my face. It's just so boring. The Republicans have the death tax, right? That's their rhetoric about the estate tax, which also is pretty boring, but they call it the death tax and everyone knows what it means. We have permitting reform. We've got to figure out both a substantive agenda that deals with this frustration that people have, and then we need to figure out how to market it. And then once we've done that, and that will happen iteratively among politicians who are competing for nominations, who's going to articulate this vision the most forcefully, the most compellingly, who's going to figure it out? Is it going to be Gina Raimondo or Gavin Newsom or Pete Buttigieg or Rahm Emanuel? It could be any number
It's
of
interesting.
people.
Those four, Raimondo, Buttigieg, Newsom, and Emanuel, they're all people who would come to mind, but they're all very different from some of the other figures in the Democratic Party. So there needs to be a little bit of a, if not a civil war, certainly a frank exchange of views within the Democratic Party. That's what you're saying.
I certainly think that we need to figure out why people are so frustrated. We need to get beyond the sort of the now pretty hackneyed conversation about whether we need to go left or right. That's not the point. The point is government, the institution that we are purportedly trying to champion, doesn't work. And until we can give people a convincing explanation for how we're going to fix that, like we shouldn't even pretend to have any pretense to power.
Good stuff from Marc Dunkelman. It's an important book, a really important book. Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress, and How to Bring It Back, because he is speaking as a progressive, as a man of the left. And it's an important argument, and particularly, I think, our aversion or progressives' aversion to power and his historical analysis. Congratulations, Marc, on the new book. And I'd love to get you back on the show. This is an issue that is going to run and run over the next few years as the Democrats begin to figure themselves out and offer an alternative to Donald Trump. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. Great conversation.
Can I step on the sea?